Have you ever really thought about what's going on in your brain during that morning caffeine buzz? Or, a night out with a few drinks? Well, it's not magic, it's chemistry. And in this explainer, we're going to break down exactly how different substances chemically change our minds and our bodies. So let's just dive right into the big question. What is actually happening up there when a chemical changes how you think and feel? It's an incredible process, and we're about to peel back the layers and get into the nitty-gritty mechanics of it all. All right, here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the brain's basic chemical setup. Then we'll get into the uppers, the ones that borrow energy, followed by the downers, which slow everything down. After that, we'll explore the others, the drugs that literally bend reality. And finally, we'll talk about the cost of all this, the inevitable payback. Okay, so before we can really get our heads around how our brain chemistry can be thrown completely out of whack, we have to understand what it looks like when it's balanced. This is the foundation for, well, every single feeling, thought, and action you have. It really all comes down to neurotransmitters. These are the brain's tiny chemical messengers. You've probably heard of them, things like dopamine, serotonin. They manage everything from how happy you feel to how motivated you are. So here's a good way to think about it. Imagine your brain chemistry is like a bank account. Your brain is constantly working to keep this account perfectly balanced. But as we're about to see, drugs act like these crazy high-interest loans. They give you a massive cash advance right now, but they demand a really steep repayment later on. All right, let's get into our first category, the uppers. These are the stimulants. These are the substances that basically let you take out a loan on your future energy, your future focus, and even your future confidence. They just speed everything up. And let's start with the most popular stimulant on the entire planet, caffeine. Now, here's the thing you have to understand about your morning cup of coffee. It doesn't actually create any energy. What it does is it blocks a chemical in your brain called adenosine, which is the thing that tells you you're tired. So you're not really getting an energy boost, you're just hitting the snooze button on your own exhaustion.
Now, nicotine is fascinating because of the illusion it pulls off. And this quote really just nails it. Nicotine doesn't actually relax you, it just resets withdrawal. That feeling of calm that a smoker gets, it's not real relaxation. It's just a temporary fix for the craving that the last cigarette created. It's so addictive because it hits your brain in less than 10 seconds, creating this super fast cycle where the drug is both the problem and the only thing that feels like a solution.
With cocaine, we're taking that whole principle to a major extreme. It just floods your brain with the pleasure chemical, dopamine, and it creates this incredible, powerful rush of confidence. But as you can see, that feeling is a total illusion. It's powered by literally burning through your brain's entire dopamine supply just for a few minutes of feeling on top of the world, which, of course, leads to an absolutely brutal crash. And this right here really puts it all into perspective. I mean, if caffeine is like taking out a tiny loan from that chemical bank account, and cocaine is a pretty big one, then methamphetamine, well, you could see that massive spike. That's like draining the entire bank account and then setting the bank on fire. It triggers a huge surge of dopamine, way more than the brain is ever meant to handle. You get an incredibly intense high, but it causes devastating damage to the very system that lets you feel pleasure naturally. Okay, on to our next category. If the uppers speed things up by spending all your brain's energy, the downers do the exact opposite. These are the depressants. They slow down your central nervous system, and they basically just quiet the whole world down. So let's look at the most common downer of all, alcohol. The whole experience is a pretty familiar three-step process, right? It starts with that warm, relaxed, confident feeling. But as your brain's communication starts to slow down, your judgment starts to fade and your emotions run high. And that eventually gives way to the come down, the hangover, which is really just your brain chemistry crashing back down to earth. Now, with opioids like heroin or fentanyl, we're talking about something terrifyingly powerful. They don't just mess with your mood. They actually hijack the most primitive part of your brain, your survival system. They essentially trick your brain into thinking the drug isn't just a want, it's a need, as critical as air or water. And that's what makes withdrawal an experience of almost unbearable suffering. Then you have benzodiazepines, or benzos, which you might know as prescription sedatives. They work by boosting a chemical called GABA, which is basically the brain's main off switch. They bring a sense of quiet and calm. But here's the danger. The brain can get so used to this artificial silence that it kind of forgets how to be calm on its own, and that leads to a really powerful dependence. And now for our third and final category, the others. These are the substances that don't just speed you up or slow you down. No, these fundamentally change and distort how you perceive reality itself.
Let's start with cannabis. As you can see, there's the feeling, time slowing down, senses getting sharper, ideas feeling incredibly profound. And then there's the function. THC, the active compound, binds to receptors that are meant for your body's own natural relaxation chemicals. So it's essentially hijacking and warping the very system your brain uses to regulate things like mood and memory.
LSD is one of the most powerful reality benders out there. It can lead to some truly profound experiences because it completely rewires how the brain processes reality. But, as this quote suggests, LSD opens the mind, but it doesn't always close the door cleanly behind it. The whole experience is deeply unpredictable and can, sometimes, lead to some pretty lasting psychological effects.
This little chart gives us a quick comparison of a few other reality benders. So let's just walk through it real quick. First, you've got MDMA. It floods the brain with serotonin, the chemical for connection and well-being, and this creates that famous feeling of deep empathy. The risk, though, is potential damage to the system that produces serotonin in the first place. Next is psilocybin or magic mushrooms. It shifts your perception, often creating this feeling of being deeply connected to nature. But the trip itself is super unpredictable. And finally, ketamine. It causes dissociation, that floating, out-of-body feeling, which can disconnect a user not just from physical pain, but from meaning itself. And all of that brings us to our final section. We've seen the highs, the slowdowns, the reality shifts. Now we have to talk about paying back that chemical debt. This is the inevitable payback. Because through all of this, there's one single overriding rule. Your brain is always trying to get back to one thing and one thing only: balance. It will fight tooth and nail to maintain its equilibrium.
So the really crucial takeaways here are these. First, that high people chase, it's often just temporary relief from a problem that the drug itself created. Second, addiction is not a moral failing. It's what happens when the brain's survival wiring gets hijacked. Third, tolerance builds up because the brain adapts, which means you start needing more and more of something just to feel normal. And finally, and this is the big one, remember that bank account? Every bit of energy or happiness a drug gives you is simply stolen from your future self.
Look, our brain's chemistry is this incredibly intricate, delicate system that's been evolving for millions of years to keep us stable and safe. Which really just leaves us with one final question to think about. What are the real long-term consequences when we just keep tipping those scales?